Welcome, one and all, to the latest Council for British Research in the Levant webinar. My name is Tawfiq Haddad. This webinar is brought to you from Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, the Kenyan Institute. As you file into the audience room in this webinar, allow me to welcome you to our latest webinar with Professor Matthew Hughes on the issue of Britain's pacification of Palestine, the British Army, the colonial state, and the Arab revolt, 1936 to 1939. The latest publication, as I said, of Professor Matthew Hughes of Brunel University. This event today is one in a series of different events that we are running to explore the history, the centenary year of the British Mandate. The Council for British Research in the Levant has organized 4 different webinars from Jerusalem, lectures. This is the 3rd in that. We had one previously on Victorian Palestine, another one 2 days ago on water policy and the legacy of British colonial water policies. Professor Hughes's talk today is on, as I said, the 1936 revolt and Britain's pacification of that. And we have one coming up on the partition on the 29th of November as well as one in-person lecture at the University of Edinburgh. Please check out our website, cbrl.ac.uk, where you can find a full listing. And in fact, the major intervention that we are doing regarding the centenary year of the British Mandate is a major 3-day conference that is scheduled to take place at Birzeit University from October 31st to November 2nd. This 3-day conference is organized with 5 other research institutes from the UK and the United States, as well as Europe. It will feature 64 different papers and a specially organized panel by CBRL on the issue of archaeology during the British Mandate. So please check out our website for those events. We are very excited to have today's lecture because Professor Hughes's book looks like a masterful study of this period, and he comes from a British military history background. Now, before I give the microphone to Professor Hughes, allow me to say a couple of words about the Council for British Research in the Levant. We're an independent UK research charity organization that exists to conduct, support, and promote humanities and social science research in the Levant. We have over 100 years of presence in the Middle East and 2 regional organizations, one in Jerusalem, where this webinar is being organized, and another in Amman. Professor Hughes is a professor of history at Brunel University in London. His 2019 Cambridge University Press book on Britain's pacification of Palestine, which this webinar is focusing on, has been translated into Arabic by the Center for Arab Unity Studies. It is a 500-page research that looks through British archival material, which is very fresh and understudied, and that's why I personally am very excited to be here today and hear what he has to say. Professor Hughes is also currently working on a book examining the British colonial state and British soldiers' actions on Borneo in the 1960s during the confrontation with Indonesia. So definitely a very interesting set of topics that we should be hearing about today. I will give the microphone over to Professor Hughes in just a second, but please take notes on the side. If you have any future questions, he will speak for roughly half an hour to 40 minutes, followed by some brief questions by myself to warm him up. And then hopefully you folks in the audience will also chime in with your own questions, and we'll hopefully have the whole thing wrapped up within 75 minutes to an hour and a half tops for the whole event. So without further ado, Professor Hughes, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides, Tawfiq?
I can indeed, and I believe the whole audience can as well.
Can you hear me okay?
I can. You were just a bit
Wonderful. Well,
garbled
thank
there.
you very much for inviting me. Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
How's that? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to speak at the Kenyan Institute. So you mentioned the publication of my book, and hold on a second. Does that appear now, the front cover? You can all see that, okay? Let me know if you can't.
Yes, we can see
right,
that.
Okay, so the system's working, fantastic. As Tufik said, my book was on the British pacification of Palestine, and it's been published into Arabic. It's interesting, I'm working on Borneo at the moment, and many of the themes today carry through to the Borneo confrontation. I'm not an expert on Israel-Palestine today, but also many of the issues that I raise, you can track through into post-48 Israel, and Israel's dealing with the Palestinians. So, I mean, for instance, the Israeli police, their founding piece of legislation is the 1926 police ordinance, which the British established under the mandate, and I'll talk a little bit about that. My book might be published into Hebrew. There was some discussion from the IDF publishing house about publishing it into Hebrew, but nothing's actually come of that as of yet. So what am I going to do today? Well, I want to talk about Britain's pacification of Palestine during the Arab Revolt. And the book starts with emergency law. And I want to flip the book and talk a little bit about the second half of the book first. And that deals with the violence of the British security forces. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the argument of the book is that really the colonial emergency legal state, what I call lawfare, is the bedrock, or was the bedrock, of Britain's pacification of Palestine. I'll talk a lot about the violence of British pacification, and some of it's quite sensational, and there are some atrocities and quite terrible things go on. But the violence is it's incidental, obviously not for the people involved, but it's incidental system of emergency rule that the British use. And this is not just particular to Palestine, it's true across the whole of the British Empire. And I can see it in Borneo in the 1960s as well. That said, the 1960s, it's a period when Britain's leaving empire, whereas the 1930s is still in the high period of empire, so the behaviour is different. So I'll talk in the second half of the lecture about what I think is the key element of pacification, which is lawfare, violence made effective by legislation. I'll talk a little bit about the resistance, which is the variable, and also Britain's desire to find loyalist or collaborator forces, which it finds both within the Jewish community and within the Palestinians. I draw some links there with the Vietnamese in the book, and I have a little discussion of Vietnamese resistance in the 60s and how powerful it was. So really, I'm going to talk about military violence first, and then I'll spend a substantial piece of time talking about legislation, and then I'll end the short lecture on issues to do with collaboration and loyalism and collaboration. And just to give some setting, the question of British violence across the empire has been very topical recently, not so much in the context of Palestine, but in the context initially of Kenya. And two key books here by David Anderson and Caroline Elkins have looked at the issues surrounding the use of violence by British troops in the 1950s in Kenya. And this then went forward to more recent studies looking at the violence during the emergency. There are conflicts here between what happens in Palestine, actually what happens in Ireland in the 1920s, through Palestine, actually through the Jewish revolt in 1945 to Malaya, Borneo, to Aden, and then to Northern Ireland. And there are now truth and reconciliation movements looking at getting the British to apologise, and also in court settlements. If you're interested in the latest word on the subject, Caroline Elkins' new book, Legacy of Violence, gives you a sense of one of the topics here today, looking at the British military violence. This book is an excellent survey across the British Empire. It's a very critical study. So, just to start with the violence, in some ways, the sort of easy bit of the lecture, there's a recent BBC News report from, I think, last week, And I am mentioned in it because there's now some movement inside of Palestine to look at some of these issues to do with historic abuses associated with the violence of the Arab revolt. And in particular, the British established, or the British launched, some quite sensational atrocities. There was one at Al-Bassa in the north. The village doesn't exist anymore. It disappeared in 1948. But at Al-Bassa in the north, the British not only destroyed a village that they held responsible for a nearby mine attack, but they also then put the villagers into a lorry, sort of a bus, and they drove it along a mine that the British had put under the road, and they blew up the bus and blew up the people in it, and they killed anything between 20 and 30 Palestinians. In Arabic accounts, there are other atrocities of the same sort along the northern border with Lebanon. And there are pictures of the bodies following the blowing of the bus in a British soldier's later memoir, because he was there at the Al-Bassa atrocity. There are other atrocities also. This is the bottom part of the news report. There's another atrocity at Hal Hall down near Hebron, where the British leave the villagers, the male villagers, in a cage with a limited access to water. Between 15 and 20 of them die. The British also have quite violent responses to any attacks on British troops. So in one instance, Manchester Regiment captures some Arab fighters, Palestinians or Arabs. British usually just use the expression Arab. They capture insurgents after a battle in which 4 of the British soldiers were killed, and the Manchester Regiment soldier form a gauntlet down which the Palestinian prisoners have to go. And they beat some of them to death, and the other ones are taken and handed to the police. They're hanged. The bodies are dumped near Palestinian villages. That's really quite a brutal response to the Palestinian insurrection of 1936, a very violent response, also an illegal response. One of the points I want to make in the second part of this talk is that these acts of violence, these extreme acts of violence, which are illegal, are sensational, but they take your eye off the key issue of the cumulative business of the British repression of the Palestinians. So these atrocities are the largest I can find, of about 20 to 30 Palestinians killed in one group. But the British have a legal and semi-legal system that allows them, for instance, to shoot Palestinians who run away following the British shouting halt, Waqif, Waqif, Waqif 3 times. And the British established in some areas were effectively free fire zones, and just shoot people at random. Now, these cumulative killings are much smaller. They're one person, one person, one person. But that's much more characteristic of the daily grind of British pacification than these quite sensational single atrocities at Al-Bassa, Hal Hall. There are others across the West Bank, all in the north in Galilee as well. Also, the British atrocity at Hal Hall was ordered at the battalion level. The atrocity at Al-Bassa was authorized at brigade level. So the point is, the Army High Command is fixed on official violence. These more sensational atrocities are not characteristic of what the Army High Command wants. It doesn't stop them happening. But for instance, at Hal Hall, the company commander, who was told to cage the men, and they subsequently died from thirst, he asked for the order in writing because he knew it was wrong, and he was told he wasn't going to get it and that he could leave the army if he didn't want to do this. So the army knew what it was doing was wrong, didn't stop it doing it, but also it meant that these sensational atrocities were organized at the battalion or brigade level. They weren't established by the army at the highest level. You'll see in a moment what I mean when I talk about the lawfare state, about the establishment of forms of permanent emergency repression. Here's the military power. Here are Scots Guards marching by the YMCA building in West Jerusalem. Here's the general in charge in the first stage of the Arab revolt, General Dill. Here's another image used on the image that shows British power. Here you have troops marching by the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. Now, before I get into the business of the emergency state, it's worth pointing out that the security forces include elements from across the British armed forces, and they also include forces such as the Arab Legion. So here on the slide, when I talk about the security forces, it's the police. The police lose control, so the army comes in. And the army has a very dim view of the police. It doesn't think the police are very good. Obviously, the soldiers of the British Army, but also CID, which is the Criminal Intelligence Division of the police. You also have the Arab Legion deployed. They have a base in northern Palestine. They deploy over from Transjordan. The Royal Air Force is heavily involved, and also the Secret Service. MI5 and MI6. Palestine is the remit of MI5 because it's inside the empire. MI6 is responsible, for instance, for intelligence work in Syria. And the British Consul General in Syria, Gilbert McKerrath, is heavily involved in working to destabilize the rebel base in Damascus. So the security forces are a great range against which the Palestinian insurgents will fight. So that's the sort of basis of the military repression: atrocities, brutality, people being shot. Probably, I think, over 7,000 Palestinians killed over the course of the revolt. I want to turn to the more mundane but more important business of colonial legislation, a sort of politics 101, if you like. The point is, the law in Palestine is the law not of the metropolis, but of the satellite areas of the British Empire. It is prerogative power. It is ruled by fiat from above. Now, in Palestine, there's no legislature. The judiciary is neutered in 1936 when the British dismissed the Chief Justice because he objects to the destruction of Old Jaffa in the summer of 1936, in June 1936. They dismiss him. So the executive, run from the Colonial Office in London, run through the High Commissioner in Jerusalem, is the sole authority in Palestine. Now, this is significant because the two attempts at a legislature in the early 1920s and the mid-1930s come to nothing. They would have been controlled by British colonial officials anyway, but the legislature is only there in London. So if the Palestinians or the Jews want to put pressure on any legislature, the only way they can do this is by going through MPs in London. Now, the Palestinians during the revolt established several media centres, quite exciting propaganda foci for trying to push the British government. And they set these up in London from 1936 to 1939. But there's no way of influencing the legislature in Palestine because there isn't one. There's an advisory council and there's an executive council, but they're both controlled by British colonial officials and by the British High Commissioner. I mean, Bengal and Cyprus had some limited local legislatures. Palestine never did. So what it meant was that the law in Palestine was through something called orders in council. Now, these orders in council are sometimes used in Britain. They were used to emergency laws in 1914 and 1939. They were also used in the 1970s for European Union legislation, but they're unusual. They're also tempered by the legislature in London, so Parliament at Westminster can affect and influence any orders in council. But orders in council are the basis of the rule in Palestine, and they mean that what you have established is an emergency state, and this is really established in the early 1920s. So when the revolt starts in April 1936, the British very quickly establish a whole raft of emergency legislation. And all of these regulations are established by the Order in Council initially in 1922. And the main cascading is from the Orders in Council to ordinances and emergency regulations. And I wanted just to mention these because they're key to what happens in 1936. The British established the Constitution of Palestine in 1922. then after the disturbances of 1929, they issued the 1931 Order in Council. And in fact, the Israelis pick up on the 1931 Order in Council through the 1937 Order in Council for the 1945 emergency regulations. And those are the regulations that the Israelis, now the Israeli Prime Minister, rather than the High Commissioner, enacts after 1948. And the 1931 Order in Council establishes the main emergency regulations, which I've listed here from 1936. And it's the 1936 emergency regulations, this is the argument in the book, that are the basis for the pacification of the Palestinians. They're what suppresses the revolt. They're usually non-lethal. They are aimed more at property than directly. They cumulatively and attritionally wear down the Palestinians, as I'll show you in a moment, through a whole set of legislations which restrict movement and food and housing. They destroy things, they take things, they fine people. On top of which, the army also shoots people and institutes illegal atrocities, as at Al-Bassa and Hal Hul. Now, the principal ordinances are here. I mentioned the 1926 police ordinance, the basis of the modern Israeli police force. But what happens from the 1922 Order in Council is the 1926 Collective Punishments Ordinance. Now,
Matthew,
in British, yeah?
Can I intervene here? We had a request from somebody online to, if you could potentially make the slides larger.
Oh, yes, of course, absolutely. Hang on a sec.
So it's just the feature, you click.
Let me just move this. I'm trying to find at the top. Hang on a sec.
At the bottom of the screen, just go two or three icons over to the right. You should,
here.
The next one. Other side.
This one?
No, other side.
Oh, here.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Excuse us. I obviously can't do it myself.
Hang on a sec.
The one right to the right of the sort of book one.
How's that?
There we go. Brilliant. Sorry for the interruption.
Is that okay?
Yes. And
That's
can I
all right.
ask you?
No problem, Truthie. Yeah.
Excellent. And then just sometimes your voice gets a little bit, something is not catching up with you. So just keep your tempo not super fast. That's all I'll say.
Okay, absolutely. So
thank you.
That's fine. So to keep an even tempo here, in 1926, the British established the principle, which is an imperial principle, of collective punishment. And this is key for the 1936 revolt and the repression thereof. Now, collective punishment is particular for the colonies. It's not a law that is established for the metropolis. In fact, the only collective punishment ordinance I can think of in Britain today is collective manslaughter with a company where somebody has died on a building site. It is not typical for the metropolis. It is typical for the satellite parts of the empire. And this idea of collective punishment is peculiar to the empire, and it's a big part of what happens in Palestine. So there's a police ordinance, there's a prisons ordinance. The 1931 Order in Council then cascades down to a new criminal code, but also a press ordinance which censors the press, and also then the emergency regulations of 1936. What then follows, and these are quite a business to track, there's a mass of amendments to the ordinances. So when the British have a regulation and the rebels get around it somehow, the British then issue a revision to the ordinance. And in 1936, 1937 and 1938, you go through the legislation, which is published in the Palestine Gazette, you see these ordinances and the revisions month after month. It's quite a business to track them, but the British close all the loopholes. They copper bottom their legislation. They have ordinances on daggers, and knives and guns, explosives, movements, masses of curfews, all established under the emergency regulations. The point is, these are incredibly versatile, very, very adaptable to respond to the revolt, and they all flow from the original legislation. The British hang up to 112 Palestinians, 2 of whom are Jewish, and they also make legal the shooting of people running. And the expression there is waqif, for halt. In fact, on Borneo, they taught the same expression in Malay, and they could shoot after saying it 3 times. The soldiers would shout rhyming phrases in English, like corned beef. Later in Aden, in the late 60s, they allegedly would shout fuck off 3 times. And then they could fire. And this is the result of the legislation. Here is collective punishment in the form of demolition. And demolition was a specific ordinance enacted under the emergency legislation. I think it still exists today. And here is the old city of Jaffa. And here is, in June 1936, British Army engineers blowing up a passageway into the old city. And this is what it looks like afterwards. Here's the passage in, and here are the passages either side. The Israelis call it Operation Anchor because it looks like an anchor shaped. British pretend that it's done for health and safety, sanitary reasons, but it's a way of destroying the rebellion in the Kasbah of Old Jaffa and also providing ingress for British troops. Now, this collective punishment in Jaffa is the most sensational single event, but pro rata, this is what happens all across Palestine. It's the rubble of villages that the British destroy as collective punishment for a rebel act nearby. And in some of the villages, pro rata, the destruction is much more extensive. Some of the villages are leveled, flattened. The British soldiers in their reports describe them as flattening the village, leveling the village. The people are usually removed, so they're primarily targeting the property. But the people are then left destitute, there's famine, there's homelessness, as the people are left on the sides outside of their village. And this is the British Army soldiers trumpeting that there's going to be another blast. This is from Old Jaffa, but this image could also fit Jenin because the British destroy large parts of Jenin in 1938 in retaliation for a rebel attack that assassinated Moffat, who was a local colonial official. And the British also searched houses internally, and these were described as punitive searches. And when the search was a punitive search, the British smashed everything inside the house. They'd also steal things, although the officers tried to stop that. But the destruction inside was matched by the destruction of the houses outside. So the British would destroy houses internally, and if the collective punishment needed to be ramped up, they would destroy the houses externally. They sometimes got the Palestinians to destroy their own houses brick by brick. They usually used demolition. So they would bring in Royal Engineers to blow up the houses with explosives provided obviously by the British Army. There are also extensive curfews. Here's one that I got from the American Colony Hotel Archive. And these curfews are extensively used across Palestine. They sometimes have daytime curfews and nighttime curfews. So what happens is I'll have a curfew 23 hours of the day. Usually the curfew is at nighttime. And in the daytime, there's a strike, so many of the Palestinians are staying at home. But curfew is a way of detaining the Palestinians at no cost to the British during midnight, during the nighttime hours. And then, of course, detention. And there's a long section in the book on detention. Detention, I'll show you in a moment, comes in different forms. There's obviously a fixed jail at Akka, but there's also the main camp north of Akka at Al-Mazrah, which is where most of the detainees are kept. There are also detainees kept down at Sarafend, at the military base, down near Jaffa, Tel Aviv. They also keep troops down in the Negev, and there are masses of informal detention of Palestinians. In the book, I posit the idea that pretty much the whole Muslim male population of Palestine experienced incarceration at some stage. And here you have the detention system. Now, I don't know if it's a gulag. It has elements of a gulag. Of course, the Soviet gulag was integral to the whole Soviet state in a way that this wasn't for the British. But it's quite interesting. The British don't just put people through the courts, civil or military. They also intern people. Now, internment, which happens in Northern Ireland in the 70s, flows from the emergency legislation. And the internment is indefinite. So you have to renew it, but you can keep a Palestinian in an internment camp for 1 year, 6 months. You can extend it to 2 years. The army also informally detained people on its bases. Usually it was for short periods of weeks, often for work to make the Palestinians build structures for the army. And the army called the Palestinians Uzulbats. It's a corruption from an Arabic word, but they called them Uzul prisons. The soldiers also detained villagers. So the Tegot wall in the north, the fence, was built by corvée, forced labor, provided by the Palestinians nearby. Security forces also, rather like Mussolini, they would banish troublemakers from one part of Palestine to another. They then had a problem that these people often mobilized the local Palestinians, so they had to move them back. They also exiled the AHC, and they exiled senior leaders abroad to places like the Seychelles. They banished non-Arab troublemakers from the country, notably Francis Newton, but also Aubrey Lees, who ended up as a fascist in the Second World War. They also detained villagers in cages that the soldiers built in the village. That's what happened at Hal Hull. They also made people report to police stations, and they put people under house arrest. It's an extensive prison system which touched the lives of all Palestinians. It doesn't kill them, it detains them. The treatment in these camps varies. There are some examples of torture, and the British established torture centres in South Jerusalem at the army base, which is now covered by housing. They also have a torture centre in Acre. So they use some of the prison archipelago to inflict illegal punishments, and they move prisoners from one place to the next, torture them at different sites. The torture is pretty grim. Some of the Palestinians jump from high buildings to escape torture. Some of the Palestinians are sodomized, both with objects, and also Bajad Abu Ghabir claimed to me that the British used local, I suppose, rapists to rape the men. There were also examples of some molestation of women in prisons. There was a female prison in Bethlehem. So it's a prison archipelago in which a lot of different things go on, some of it legal, some of it illegal. The result is famine. Here's the American Colony Hotel issuing bread and milk to Jerusalemites in 1938. And the British military notes the presence of famine, destitution, not helped by a locust plague at the same time in 1937-38 across Palestine. So British are targeting the people, this is the point of the book, as much as they're targeting the rebels. As a military historian, the British do things militarily to fight the rebels, but I'm making the point to you that the military side is second fiddle, plays second part to the main focus, which is the repression of the people. And it's about control. Here are the gates going up on the city, on the gates of the city walls of the old city of Jerusalem, and the British control through the emergency legislation. They use dogs. Here is a South African brought in from another part of the empire with a Doberman, which is used as a sniffer dog. And it can search for explosives and guns. Here are two soldiers, dog ready for action. The dogs are used for tracking. And here are the searchlights by Jerusalem. The British scour the hills to control the area. Here are 5 British officers on the walls, the curtain wall of Jerusalem with a searchlight. It's a nice image looking out over the countryside. The British censor telephones. There aren't very many of them, but they censor the telephones. They also monitor telephones, and in fact, the Jewish intelligence then infiltrates the British to also do the same thing. And they redact and they close newspapers, sometimes Hebrew language, but nearly always Arabic language. So one of the newspapers, remember which one, it's closed for a whole year. They also redact large sections of the newspaper, so you can't read what's underneath. And the British also make newspapers report official notices. So the newspapers have to do the bidding of the British. And it's resistance that's variable. And here I've got three key resistance leaders. You've got here on the at the bottom here is Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti. Here is Fawzi al-Kouchi. Here's al-Qassam. And the problem is al-Qassam is killed in 1935. And interestingly, the British target him because they know he is a strong figurehead for the resistance. And arguably, he was shot. I mean, even when they captured him, he was shot by the police. The police monitored the chase of al-Qassam using a plane. He was a key figure that they wanted to bring down. Fawzi al-Kouchi was an excellent leader in 1936. He was only there for a short period of time. And the leadership of the revolt devolved to Hajj Amin, who exiled himself. He left in 1937 and he went to Lebanon, and he provided the main leadership for the resistance. You might want to talk to me more about that, because I compare him in the book to the Vietnamese, and I look at Ho Chi Minh and Lưu Duan, and I compare him to the operational leadership of Giap in the field, defeated the French. And in a way, here you have your Ho Chi Minh, and here you have your Giap. And I was struck by the power and the energy of al-Qassam. And had al-Qassam lived, he would have mobilized a very strong resistance. And I spent 2 chapters in the book looking at the resistance. And my argument is that the passion of the people, the Palestinians, keeps the resistance, the war going for a long period of time, but the passion of the people is not directed by good leadership. And I argue in the book that the British would have repressed, using all the methods above, the Arab revolt more quickly if in the first stage of the revolt to October 1936, they hadn't been forced to enact a diplomatic track, which the army wasn't keen on. And then in September 37, when the second stage of the revolt erupts with the assassination of Andrews in Nazareth, the British army is distracted by the Czechoslovakian crisis. And in October 1938, the British, to use a modern term, surge troops into Palestine. There's a section in my book where I look at the numbers of troops, and there's a massive wave of troops, and they repressed the revolt in about 6 months. I mean, one of the problems the British have, and the British generals complain about this, is there's no leadership that they can decapitate, cut off. Their complaint is the Palestinians are, it's an eruption of violence, and the British can't control it because they have to target everyone. There's a non-existent leadership. You might have a different view on that. And the British see the revolt in terms of anarchy and chaos because many parts of the rural areas descend into lawlessness. And I talk in the book about many of the rebel attacks on the people. I mean, the Palestinian people are attacked both by the British army and also by elements of the Palestinian resistance. I mean, in some cases, rebel fighters institute fines and curfews on Palestinian areas, as do the British, when they replicate British behavior. And that's part of my argument about the problems of the resistance. And I look at Ho Chi Minh and I talk a little bit about the Vietnamese and about their military insurgency, about their discipline, about the communist resistance versus the Islamic resistance of al-Qassam or the nationalist resistance of Haj Amin. I was very impressed by the long war that the Vietnamese fought compared to the chaos and infighting of the Palestinians. And I suppose to sort of think a little bit about this more broadly, I can't think from the American Revolution in 1776 to the end of British rule in India in 1947, I can't think of a single successful insurgency against the British Empire. Now, the one exception is maybe Ireland in 1922. The Irish lose the north of Ireland to Protestant settlers, and they still remain a part of the empire. The Irish civil servants still swear an oath of allegiance to the British crown. That changes a little bit in 1937. It's not until 1949 that the Irish Republic emerges from the end of empire. And it's that mastery of colonial control that my book focuses on, which the Israelis pick up on in 1948. And as I said earlier, the Israelis used the 1945 emergency legislation, which becomes Israeli law. And the Israelis then layer on new laws, but they're built on the old principles of the British Empire. And the Israeli Prime Minister now has the power of the High Commissioner to enact undemocratic, untouched by any legislative scrutiny, laws to control the people. So the power simply shifts, but the systems of power remain the same. And one of the things I point out on the next slide is issues to do with collaboration. Divide et impera, divide and rule. The British work very successfully to divide and rule. They work with collaborators associated famously for the British with the Nashashibis. There's a meeting at Yatta in the autumn of 1938. Here's the British general in charge talking to Palestinians who've been brought there in a stage-managed affair. It's Nashashibi. Here's the Union Jack. And the Nashashibis are part of a movement, certainly within the Palestinian community, that discombobulates the resistance. The British and the Jews work hard to promote Nashashibi collaboration, but the real element that works with the British are loyalist forces and auxiliaries, mostly associated with the Yishuv, with the Jewish community. And many of Israel's future leaders go through these British-run units during the Arab Revolt, Moshe Dayan, for instance. But many of the early Israeli army leaders were formerly trained in British units. You can see here they've got British equipment as well. Now, it's interesting that mostly people remember special night squads that fight in Galilee, very brutal. They're led by the British, but the bulk of the troops come from the Jewish agency. And these British troops train the special night squads to fight the Palestinian resistance. But much of the time, they're simply going into villages and they're more brutal than the British troops. They decimate, so like the Roman legions of classical proportions, they shoot every 10th villager to deter any rebel attacks. And the Jewish soldiers within the special night squads comment on how powerful the British are, how they see this colonial force where they shoot Palestinians and where they show how the colonial system can work to keep the people in place. And one of the key leaders is not Wingate. Wingate is eventually forced out, a man called Bredin, who's involved in some of these shootings. Interestingly, the British Army is not that keen on Wingate's night squads. They see him as an irregular force. The British Army is conservative as an institution. It's regular, not irregular. And the violence of the special night squads is partly a function of the fact that there aren't enough British troops on the ground. When the British troops arrive in October 38, the British Army closes down special night squads, although it has a half-life under Bredin into 39. This slide's interesting because to read it out, there are additional police, supernumeraries, Gaffiers, Notrim, temporary additional constables, special constables, private police, auxiliary port, temporary additional police, Jewish supernumerary, frontier protection, There are auxiliary special police, railway protection, night watch, special police. So some of these are synonymous, but it gives you a sense of how the British are working to bring in loyalist forces in all sorts of different forms, some of which are paid by the Jewish agency, some of which are paid by the British, but the British established camps for these Jewish supernumerary police, and the A to B category police officers get regular army training from the British troops in Palestine at the time. So this is a great force multiplier. It doesn't win the war for the British, but it's another element to the matrix of repression against the Palestinians. There's also in the book on intelligence and the use of intelligence, much of which comes from the Yishuv, from Jews in Palestine who work closely with the British Army, and they also translate documents for the British Army, and they provide interrogators. Although the British bring in colonial officials from the Sudan who can speak Arabic as well. If you look at Windgate's copied papers in the British Library in London on Palestine, they've been translated into English, but I think they're from Ezra Danin, who spoke Arabic. He translated them for the British, and Ezra Danin was very close to the British Army. That is it, and that's at 41 minutes, Tufik. So I said I wouldn't speak for more than 40 minutes. So over to you.
Bless, Matthew. I'm quite blown away by your presentation, which was chock full of, I mean, enormous amounts of detail and depth to it, on a level that I think many of our listeners, as well as myself, as somebody who is a reader to some extent of Palestinian history, elements of which we were simply unaware of. So I thank you for your well-organized and comprehensive study, and I congratulate you on it as a starting point. I have not had the opportunity to read the book. We don't have a copy here in Jerusalem, and it's not featured in the local library, in the local bookstore. With that said, I'd like for you, if I could ask you, certainly as a historian, of British military historian, can you speak to sort of painting the picture as to why was it so important for Britain to win this war? Where did Palestine fit in the overall architecture of the empire at this time, and why did they devise such brutal methods to really go for it?
Can I just say, the brutality that's in the book, if you read, it's quite shocking. It's actually a lot less than was enacted in other colonial contexts before the First World War. So in the late 19th century, the high renaissance of eliminationist, racist small wars shifts after the First World War. And the Amritsar massacre in India has a big impact on the British Army, because the British Army realizes it needs to shift from eliminationist small wars to the managed brutality of imperial policing. So that it could be a lot worse. I mean, I do make comments in the book in terms of the limits to violence, but the British do manage and limit what they do in a way that occupied Europe under the Germans in the Second World War is completely different. So the brutality, I think, needs to be put into context both within the span of the British Empire and also contextualised with other imperial powers. There's a lot of similarities between British torture in Palestine and what the French do to the FLN in Algeria in the late 50s. In fact, the Al-Biyar torture house, which the Foreign Legion and the Paras ran in Algeria, is similar to the one at Talavera camp in South Jerusalem, but without the automatic post-torture execution. Also, sexual violence towards women seems to have been quite muted. There's an appendix in the book, and I wrote an article on this. In terms of the empire, Second World War, and the British can see the war brewing. They can see the importance of Palestine as a staging area. So the army is very keen to fix the Arab revolt so that it can deploy back to Europe and then use Palestine, as it does in the Second World War, as a huge staging base, to send troops one way and to send troops to North Africa. So if you remove Palestine, leaving aside the question of settlement or the Balfour Declaration, in purely strategic terms, the British were going to hold on to the place. And then after the Second World War, the geopolitics changed.
Thank you. I encourage audience members to put their questions in the question and answer button. So please don't be shy there. We'll be getting to those in a second. By my first question, I didn't mean to, I hear very much what you said regarding the fact that the actual violent aspect of the mandate was not the central aspect of mandatory policy. And you really wanted to emphasize this lawfare aspect and the different ordinances. To what I was struck by, firstly, I mean, obviously, I think there were two elements of that. Of course, one to which you alluded was the fact that Israel would later inherit large dimensions of this lawfare regime, which, as you described, was a fairly comprehensive, all-out sort of attack on all facets of Palestinian life and its ability to withstand or resist British policies. But what I'd like to ask has to do with to what extent this sort of comprehensive legal infrastructure that the British established there, first, to what extent was it unique in Palestine? And second, to what extent did it actually push things in the direction of more violent struggle?
Well, I can answer the first question fairly easily. I mean, it wasn't unique to Palestine. There's the same in Ireland in the early 20s. Now, the racial element affects what the British do. So the British treat, as they would classify it, white, brown, and black people differently in the context of the empire at the time. So the structures that I have discussed, you can see the same ones across the British Empire. And in fact, I see them in Borneo in the 1960s. They're slightly muted because it's the end of empire. And there are some changes because of the local system where Malaysia is being formed. But it's pretty much the same. They don't moderate it. I mean, what I'm struck by with the British troops is that they view the Palestinians, the soldiers, fairly positively, the police less so, and that affects their violence. So, I mean, I have Palestinians who were there at the time, and one of them said to me, the army was quite mechanistic. They would mechanistically destroy things. But the police, it was visceral, because they were there for a long period of time. And I imagine it's the same for Jewish settlers. It's, they're not going home. They've got skin in the game. The soldiers, this was another job, smash up a village, move on, and then eventually they'd go back to Britain. They weren't staying there. So that affected their violence. So there's some unique elements in Palestine in terms of the soldiers' relationship to local people. And the soldiers were generally well disposed to Palestinians in a way that they weren't to the Jews in 1946-47, where there's a lot more racist language. In terms of whether it pushed in the direction, I'd say that these legislative structures and the violence, I don't think it pushed the Palestinians to more violence. I think the Palestinian violence was a reaction to their anger at what was happening. The British just clamped down very hard on it. So I don't see the Palestinian violence becoming amplifying the violence because of what the British do. I think the violence was there on its own because of the Palestinian resistance and anger at what was happening. I mean, it's a tribute to the Fellahin, it's a tribute to the Palestinian peasants that it lasted as long as it did, because the British army, I mean, pressed down very hard, and the people who suffered were largely the rural folk away from any official gaze, and the British army could do what it wanted out in the countryside, less so in Jerusalem or Jaffa or somewhere where there were more restrictions. They're the people who really felt the rasp of British pacification.
Sure, indeed. You mentioned something actually that I found quite, I had never heard before of that the British actually even kicked out some non-Arab troublemakers. And you referenced a fellow named Francis Newton and
a woman.
Oh, excuse us.
A woman,
So can you tell us a little bit about this? Because I'm curious to what extent there was either back in the UK or locally, there was some form of resistance to this, at least within the UK polity.
Well, there was, because William Gallagher, the communist MP, I think he's a Scottish communist MP, he raises the issue of famine and destitution in Palestine in Parliament in London. And the Secretary of State for the colonies has to respond. And he responds by saying, no, there's nothing bad going on. But there's pressure put on London through Parliament in London. And it's in Hansard, the record of Parliament, this comment from Gallagher. Within Palestine, Frances Newton was very anti-Zionist, and she was very pro-Palestinian, and she left the country to go back to Britain, and the British didn't let her back in. So they banished her and they stopped her coming back in because she kept making representations. And she did this through the Jerusalem and East Mission, the Anglican mission based in, is it St. George's Cathedral in quite near where you are, in yes. East Jerusalem. So the files from there are in Oxford, and the church makes extensive records of all the brutality. And some of that comes from Frances Newton because she translates material from Arabic, and that appears in the files. And she makes representations to the British Army, which she can do as a British woman. And she also helps the propaganda that the Palestinians and the Arabs are putting out in London to try and put more pressure on the British. Aubrey Lees, I think, was anti-Semitic because he made anti-Semitic comments. He was a colonial official. He used to be in the British Army. And he was present at several atrocities on the edge of Jaffa, Tel Aviv, one of which 4 policemen shot a Palestinian. They tortured him first at the police station. And then the police sergeant, a lot of euphemisms here, the police sergeant called for his special squad. So the special squad was the torture squad to take the prisoner for a ride. The ride is a euphemism, shoot him. And the prisoners are invariably shot trying to escape. So the 4 policemen stop the vehicle in Jaffa, get the man out and tell him to, they don't speak Arabic, they go like that, go away. The man doesn't go because he knows what's going to happen. So the soldiers stand back and they shoot him with the rifle. Terrible injuries, they're described in the papers. He's writhing on the ground. One of the policemen goes up to him and shoots him in the head, so a coup de grace. It's the only instance I've found in Palestine of anyone being prosecuted. And Aubrey Lees happens to be at that place at that time because he's recording another incident where Palestine policemen, again British, go into a poor Palestinian area, is it Manshia, which is on the edge between Jaffa and Tel Aviv. They go in, they shoot people, they smash the place up, terrible injuries, old men injured, a woman's shot trying to hold a baby. And he's there recording that, and then he comes across the other shooting. And Aubrey Lees makes a big fuss about this. He says this is wrong. I think I think he's anti-Semitic, that's clear, because he ends up as a fascist in the war, and the British then jail him back in Britain for being a fascist, Nazi sympathizer. But his records are about what goes on, and he's very, as you say, pro-Palestinian. I mean, he's working for the Palestinians, but he's a colonial official. So they sack him and send him back to London, and then he gets caught up with the Nazis back in London. So there's only a few examples like that I know of. They also banned journalists. So a Swiss journalist was banned, and journalists from other countries like Germany trying to come in, the British don't give them visas. They also stopped the foreign press from Egypt and Lebanon coming into Palestine, so the Palestinians can't read easily the Egyptian Arabic press on what's going on. It's a real sort of security state. I mean, it's incredibly effective. It's very at a fairly minimal cost. It does the job, but there's a very big deployment of troops. It's one of the largest deployments of British troops in peacetime between the 2 wars. From in late 1938, a lot of the British Army goes to Palestine.
Fascinating, and the parallels are very present today. In any case, I'm going to go to questions from the audience members. Please put your questions in the question and answer feature at the bottom. I'm going to start off with Alex Worsful's question, who says, "Hi, Professor Hughes. I recently finished your fascinating book, and it gives the impression of a well-organized British counterinsurgency that used sophisticated and practiced methods to end the revolt. Do you think that the Arab-Palestinian violence against the British imperial state had a tangible impact on changing British policy direction in Palestine, either temporarily or permanently?"
Well, it did. It's an excellent question. As I said in one of the last slides, the British are very successful in repression, from the American from 1783 up till 1947, the Palestinians do get what they want, in that there's a conference in London in early 1939, and as you know, then in May 1939, there's the White Paper. Now, my expertise is really more on the military side. I personally am surprised why, and I say this in the conclusion to the book, why the Palestinians didn't make more of the May 39 White Paper, which was going to end Jewish immigration. The Second World War then upsets the whole situation, and after the war with the Holocaust, there's a completely different situation in Palestine. But they do achieve what they want to achieve, which is at the end of the revolt, the British reverse the Peel Commission, they reverse the partition plan, the Woodhead Commission starts doing that, so the British work the diplomatic track, and that's influenced by the resistance of the Palestinians. So if the Second World War hadn't happened, and the 1939 White Paper had come into effect, you would have had a situation, if the British could stop immigration, you would have had a situation with a large Palestinian majority and a much smaller Jewish minority. So having said the revolt is unsuccessful, it is actually successful, but it's undone by other historical events. But if the Palestinians had more organized resistance, I think they could have achieved much more, they could have had more effect more quickly. I mean, if you compare it to the Jewish revolt in 1945, which I know the British treat differently because they see the Jews as European, they don't treat them in the same way they treat the Palestinians, but the laws that the British use against the Jews are the same as the ones they use against the Palestinians. They just don't enact them to the fullest degree. And the Jewish resistance pushes back in a way that the Palestinians don't always. So if the British flog a lot of people, whip. When they try and do that to the Jews then take several British officers and whip them, and it stops. So it's partly the nature of the resistance. There's also partly a racial element in terms of how the British perceive the Jews. There's also a lobby, so the Jews have got a lot more pressure to put on Britain in international political terms. But there is success at the end of the revolt. Yes, Alex. Thank you for your question.
Indeed, although I think an important thing to emphasize is the results of the 39 rebellion and the pacification, successful or not, certainly paved the way or established the conditions for what happens in 47, 48, because Palestinian society is so devastated.
Yeah, very good point. Rashid Halidi makes that point in the War for Palestine book, and I think that's a point very well put, which is that by 1947-48, regardless of how you view the Palestinian resistance, the people have been so badly discombobulated and forced apart by what happened from 36 to 39. I mean, I think there's another story there in 48 about unity and Palestinian resistance and organization and military strength, and a kind of argument in terms of who's more powerful and why. But your point is well put, Tufik, about the Palestinians. And the revolt rumbles on because the British carry on repression in 41, 42, 43. It's just at a much lower level. It's not like the end of the Second World War. The Arab revolt doesn't end on one day. It's just by September 39, it's sort of fizzled out. But the British are still running Nashashibi gangs in September 39. They're still looking for loyalists. They're still fighting the rebels. So the problems and the dislocation carry on into the 40s. And as you say, when the war with Israel comes in 47, 48, the Palestinians have to rely on self-serving armies from Egypt and Jordan and places who have their own interests.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you've done a brilliant job of painting the military picture and how Great Britain at the time engaged in this pacification campaign. But this emphasis on the military side, I think, to some extent takes away from, at least in popular Palestinian memory, the 1936 uprising or revolt is remembered, at least for its initial first 6-month stage, which is organized around a general strike.
Yeah.
And So could you speak a little bit to the non-military dimensions that
Absolutely.
we're actually taking on
Yeah.
and how the British addressed those? Because if I'm not mistaken, you had, and in fact, we picked this date, the October date for your
Yeah.
talk, because the end of the strike takes place in October 1936, the first wave of the
Yeah.
36 rebellion. So how did Britain deal with this,
Yeah.
workers' action, shall we say?
Yeah, I have a whole section in the book on the strike, the cost of the strike. I looked at the pay rates of different workers, and I looked at strike pay to keep them out of work. My argument, and this may not be an argument that is particularly popular with Palestinians, is that the general strike was a disaster, and it was a disaster for the Palestinians. It took them out of work, and in Haifa, for instance, which didn't ever properly go on strike, it just led to a big influx of Jewish labour. In other areas, like the Jaffa port, where they were giving the Jaffa seamen money, they didn't manage to gather enough money from the Palestinian population. Many of the richer Palestinians went abroad. So the prices to rent an apartment in Beirut soared because all the richer Palestinians were leaving because they were being, they saw it, extorted for money. But the Jaffa seamen, the payment, kept them out of work. But then what happened was the trade shifted to the new port in the north at Haifa. And the British kept open the railways, they kept open the roads for trade. And the Palestinians effectively in the daytime kept themselves inside in jail. And they basically impoverished themselves. And the strike was not well organized. It wasn't properly financed, both within the Palestinian community and also from Arab and Muslim communities abroad. They didn't get enough money. And the result is simply you have a strike that isn't coordinated properly with military action. A lot of people were ignoring the strike. So one of the things you see is shops opening illegally. Some of these are Christian Palestinians, but not always. And they'll serve food and they'll open up the shop from the back of the shop. Kids would still go out and get sweets, which shows that they could still go out and buy candy. So the strike had the opposite effect to the one intended. And I suppose I come back to the Vietnamese element of all the different aspects of resistance to colonial rule need to be properly coordinated. You might probably disagree, but I didn't see that coordination with the general strike. They just simply didn't have the money to pay people to go on strike. And Jewish labor filled gaps when the Palestinians pulled their labor force out. So
that's the
no,
point.
it's just not well organized in my view.
Thank you. So we'll switch to Jack. No, excuse me. Stephen Kelly had a question that I wanted to make sure you got.
Can't see these. Yeah.
No, I'll read it out. Don't worry.
Yeah,
you had mentioned, of course, the participation of Jewish immigrants in the British police force. But basically, Stephen Kelly asked, did the British military personnel clearly see themselves as being on the side of the Jewish settlers?
No. The British soldiers.
Military personnel, that's what he's asking
military
about.
Personnel. No, I would say not. The strong sense I get from reading regimental journals and soldiers' papers is disinterest, a lack of bias either way. And if there's any interest, the interest tends to be with the Palestinians. They make a lot of racist comments about Jews. They're impressed by the Jews because they think they're very industrious. They think they're quite Western. They think they're very efficient. They think they're well organized. They think the kibbutzim look rational and they look clean and not like a Palestinian village. So they assess the Jews as being more European, but they don't like them. They make strange comments. One of the comments they make is the Jews have curious little eyes. And they also make a whole series of anti-Semitic tropes about Jews being organized and being conspiratorial. But the soldiers train the Jews and they treat them completely differently. So in one instance, there's a Jewish force, sort of paramilitary, and they have grenades and they use the grenades against a cafe, a Palestinian cafe. And when the British come along, the Jewish men wait there. So when they know that when the British come, they're not going to treat them the same as the Palestinians. In another case on a settlement, the British capture, it's either grenades or weapons. And one of the senior Jewish people comes along and talks the British officer out of taking the weapons. They're illegal weapons. but the British leave the weapons on the settlement. So they certainly treat the Jews very, very differently. They train large numbers of them. Wingate, he's a Plymouth Brethren Christian, so a pretty hardcore Christian. He's very strongly Zionist. But if you read the accounts from the three officers below him, in the force that he runs, Bala Bredin and the two other officers, they don't give any sense of it's more of a military job that they have to do. They're not hostile to the Jewish soldiers. They just really observe them. I'd say there's a distance. But I always think that with British soldiers in colonial campaigns, it's in three groups. They're either overtly racist and violent, they're disinterested, they don't have anything positive or negative to say. They sometimes observe things, but usually not in the context of the people. They don't see the people. And then sometimes they're positive. One of the things I see in Borneo is a certain positivity about one community, the Dayak. Most of the time they sit in the middle group. In the top group, the more racist and negative view, you see this partly with racist language, but also with deployment to certain areas. And I see this in some measure with the Jews. But as you say, large numbers of Jewish men went through British military training. So there was a good connection between the British Army and the Jews. But hell, the Jews are helping the British sort out a problem that they once sorted out before the war with Germany. So the fact that the Jews are willing to help and deal with this Palestinian insurrection, so the British Army can go back and get to the real business of soldiering in France against Germany, that's a boost for the British Army. So they would naturally, the Jews aren't firing on them, the Jews aren't fighting with them. So there's no animosity in that way.
Thank you for that clarification. Very insightful. I'm going to go with one last question, which is from Sameh Youssef. He's put it in the chat menu, but that's all right. And he asks, is there a precedent that an ex-British colony managed successfully to claim compensation for the British crimes committed during the colonization period based on evidence similar to the ones that you presented in your book?
Well, that's interesting because many years ago when I started this project, I ran a conference and it was about the British Army and counterinsurgency, part of which was Palestine, but also elsewhere. And the big issue then was Kenya. And you're spot on that the Kenya case is led in Britain to a court case. So there's money involved and there's blame involved. And the Kenya case surrounded some really awful events in Kenya in the 50s. Interestingly, the worst torture and atrocity in Kenya was not committed by the British Army. It was committed by white settlers, white settler reserve units, and black loyalist troops who fought with the British. I mean, it's the people who are there as settlers who got the most investment. The British troops were not committing and if you read the book, it's really awful, castration, chopping off people's ears, I mean, terrible torture. And that was committed, allegedly, by certain elements within the security forces. And that led to the court case. And now that's happening with Malaya. And what I saw in the BBC report, which my book was in which my book was cited, was that there's, you know more about this, but there's a movement now in Israel for the Palestinians to make a case for what happened with the British. I'm not a lawyer, and I was contacted on several occasions about this, but it was more for information. I wasn't by a law firm or anything. But in the Kenya case, the British Foreign Office was involved and several of their officials turned up at the conference because it was a hot topic, both for diplomatic reasons, but also for financial legal reasons. So it's up to somebody, I suppose, to work the legal track, but I don't know how it would be done, because I think you'd have to work the legal track in London, you couldn't do it in Israel or Jerusalem or whatever.
Right, right. Matthew?
You'd be suing in the British courts, so you'd have to go to Britain.
Indeed, indeed. Matthew Hughes, you've been listening to Matthew Hughes speak about his book and research on Britain's pacification of Palestine, the British Army, the colonial state, and the Arab revolt from 1936 to 1939. This has been a webinar brought to you by the Kenyan Institute, the Jerusalem branch of the Council for British Research in the Levant. Please check out our website where you can see all our events and activities. Today's webinar has been the third in a series of special events focusing on the centenary year of the British Mandate. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Professor Hughes, for a brilliant lecture and a great study.
Thanks
have
to
a
all of
great
you.
night, folks. All the best, folks. Take care.